beauty, welcome back to my channel. Welcome back to the past. Today we're talking about the books that I read in November. Yes, I know it's been a long time. This video has been so long in coming, but I did some vlog style recaps of the books that I was reading in November, and today I'm here to share them, the culmination and the compendium of all these vlog style recaps that I captured during the 4 or closer to 5 weeks of reading that I called my November reads. I was participating in Lalathon, I was participating in Nonfiction November Readathon, and I also had some books that I had to read because I had to do reviews. So these are the 9 books that I read in November. Enjoy! The book that I read for Lalathon was The Dinner by Herman Koch, and I'm holding up the hardcover version even though I read the paperback version. Yes, I have 2 copies of the same book. I had this one on my TBR for some time, and I got this one in my 30 books for $3 haul that I shared about a month and a half ago. So if you want to know how I got 30 books and only paid $3, then definitely go ahead and watch the video. I'm going to link down below. But yeah, I have 2 copies of the same book. And while I prefer to own hardcovers, I prefer to read paperbacks because these are easier to walk around with. They're easier and lighter to carry. And I do a lot of reading on my commute, my moving around New York City. So I read this one, so I'm going to hold up this one. The Dinner by Herman Koch is an exquisitely prepared and tantalizingly served meal. It mirrors a multi-course meal, and the main characters are 2 couples who are sitting at a restaurant dinner and about to have the evening of their lives, as well as other people who kind of interlope and reveal themselves to be main characters as well. So while a lot of the story does take place at this dinner in this restaurant scene, we also are treated to flashbacks to earlier incidents that explain why the couples are sitting at the table, and reveals a lot about who the characters are. Their actions in the earlier scenes that were mentioned, as well as their reactions to what each other is saying at this dinner, really provide an adequate and pretty complete picture of who these characters are. And so even though most of the story takes place in one night, we really get a lot of character development. And the novel is told in this, like I said, tantalizing way. So while we think we know a lot about the characters going in, as the plot is revealed, and over the course of just a few hours, we get to see who these characters are, their differences, but also their similarities as individuals, but also in terms of the couples presenting a united front despite their very significant differences. I enjoyed this book a lot. I like the way the author compared the evolution of this plot with the evolution of a multi-course dinner, and how certain aspects of the dinner are supposed to appeal to different parts of your senses. I thought it was skillfully done to set this novel in a restaurant scene as opposed to maybe a family style dinner, because in a restaurant every diner has an opportunity to choose their own meal. And so while you might have 2 people who start off with the same appetizers, by the time you've gotten to the main course or dessert, they could have had very different experiences. But also the way a meal is prepared in the kitchen is not necessarily going to determine how each individual diner experiences it, because your experience of a meal is going to be based on your own unique tastes, not just the meal itself. And so I thought that the comparison between the meal and the uniqueness of each person's enjoyment or experience really reflected greatly on how this book evolved. I loved it. I loved a lot of things about it. I'm still thinking whether or not it's a perfect book, whether it deserves a 5-star rating. The book is set in the Netherlands, and it was originally written in Dutch. So it's actually translated fiction. The translator is Sam Garrett. And there were no awkward pauses for translation or transcription. So for a long time, I didn't even realize that the novel was translated fiction. And so I thought even the translation was skillfully achieved. And over the course of just under 300 pages, the author explores some really big themes. He talks about politics and political involvement. He explored crime and punishment and various levels of crime, various levels of criminalization and criminality, and what punishment look like or should look like depending on who the perpetrator of each individual crime was. He explored very adequately, I think, the whole psychological discussion of nature versus nurture and adoption versus hereditary inclinations, as well as mental disorders and local and international politics. And so I thought the author really delved into a lot of big themes, but did it so well that they felt like just subplots in this book, but he was also accomplishing a really interesting psychological drama. So on the front of this copy, I guess on both of them, Gillian Flynn from Gone Girl leaves a blurb, and she calls this book chilling, nasty, smart, shocking, and unputdownable. And it's interesting because Gillian Flynn is the author of Gone Girl. If you've read the book or watched the movie, you know, includes a lot of psychological drama and the question about whether children should be blamed for their parents' actions and how those actions have influenced the child. And I thought that the author really delved into that cleverly and expertly in this one, which at the end, a lot of these characters, maybe all of the characters, are unlikable, but you also feel some amount of sympathy and empathy for them. And so I thought that this book reminded me of other books where the author has played with my emotions, played with my need to feel compassion for a character. So this one reminded me of books where the author flirts with the idea of you as a reader trying to justify crimes that are committed by a main character that you feel in some way empathy or sympathy towards because of their upbringing, because of who they have as parents. And so Herman Koch's The Dinner reminded me of Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita because it is the most recent example of a book where the author, I felt like, really pushed that boundary between understanding a character and in your mind also trying to justify their wrongs. Right now, I'm not sure what my rating is. It's somewhere between a 4 and a 5. I'm gonna let the story settle on me a little bit longer while I try to figure out whether I approve of Herman Koch psychologically manipulating me as a reader, even though I enjoyed it. It's really cold outside, so pardon all the winter gear indoors, but I finished reading Little Fires Everywhere and just wanted to tell you about it. I loved it. I'm giving it 4 stars, I think, because it wasn't a perfect book. There were parts in the middle where some of the explanation felt a little bit superfluous, but I love the themes and I love the way the author explored those themes. Some of the subjects that this book really explored was relationship between mothers and daughters and what motherhood looks like, surrogacy and adoption and abortion, and very difficult topics that are relevant to women. But she also showed men and the role that they play in these relationships, kind of on the periphery, but also very necessary in those interactions. And the fact that the author is female, she does show these complicated relationships that exist with men and women as women kind of take control over family situations, and women are the ones who are kind of in the nurturing role and the ones who create the family system. But she casts men as these very important supporting characters, the strong silent supporter, the one who we need and we rely on to do things, but he's not really the caregiver. He's not really the final say in the household. And I like the way she plays with this idea of how men, while they seem like they're in control, while it seems like we live in a patriarchal society, a lot of the decisions that are made about the family are made by women. I also really enjoyed how she played with art in this book. I don't know if Celeste Ng is a visual artist herself, but she describes art in a way in this book that made me want to go to a museum, made me want to go to an art gallery. One of the main characters, Mia Warren rather. Well, her name's both. I hope that's not a spoiler. The descriptions of her art and how she expresses her thought and how she comes to a final picture. It's just so beautiful. I don't know where Celeste Ng got the ideas from, unless she is a very talented and accomplished artist herself, but it was so beautifully done. And in describing the art, because the artist in the book uses the art to represent characters, I felt like it was such a beautiful connection between how you would represent a character with pictures and how you'd represent them with words in a novel. I think I might want to improve the rating on this book, so I'm keeping it at a 4 right now because I want to think a little bit more about it, but that's a very conservative 4, and I think I might improve and increase my rating as time goes by. Again, it's not a perfect book. Celeste Ng has this idea, she has this writing style of starting the story kind of in the middle, but in this case, the way we start the story is where we get to almost at the end of it, and it makes things a lot easier, I suppose, make things a lot easier to adjust, knowing how some of the situations are going to resolve, what kind of climax they're going to come to in the end. But I admired her writing in this book. I want to write like this. Right now, I'm calling Celestine my writing muse, my writing inspiration. But for now, I'm gonna move on to the next book that I'm gonna read, which is The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt. It's a 700-page book. And I have one day, not even a full day left in Lalathon. So this Lalathon experience is probably going to be extended just because I want to read the 3 books, but not necessarily stick to the timelines that Lala set out. I finished the 3rd book for Lalathon, and that's The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt. This is the 2013 Pulitzer Prize winner, which I've had on my shelf now for a year or 2, and I'm so glad that I finally read it, and I read it because of Lalathon. And this is a book that I really enjoyed. It is 771 pages, so it is quite a tome and quite an accomplishment for me to have finished reading it. So I'll tell you what it was about. We have a 13-year-old boy named Theo Decker who we meet we meet him as an adult. He's 27 years old when we meet him. He's holed up in a hotel, a seedy hotel it seems like, in Amsterdam, where he made a quick escape from New York. And he's still reeling from a 14-year separation from his mother. And while he discusses and speaks about his mother in a very real way, as though the separation is new, we realize pretty quickly that the separation is permanent because 14 years ago, his mother died. And he still feels guilty. He's having survivor's guilt for his mother's death. So he's not just affected by her death in an emotional way. He feels like he's kind of responsible because on the day when she died in a blast at the museum, which while it's not mentioned, while it's not named, seems to be the Metropolitan Museum of Art, because they go there in search of his mother's favorite piece, which is painting by Dutch masters. Other than that, however, they're at the museum because they're on their way. Their mother has had to take a day off work because they have a parent-teacher conference because 13-year-old Theo has gotten in trouble at school, and so his mother has been called in. So they're taking a day off work. There's a rainstorm, and so they duck into the museum to get some kind of a shelter. And while they're there, there is a explosion and the mother dies. Except while it's repeated many times in the narrative that the mother is dead, you find, maybe it's just me, I found myself thinking that maybe she wasn't dead. That is something that comes through from the beginning. The fact that the reason that he keeps mentioning his mother's passing is because it's not real. But as you read more into the story, you witness the explosion, at least from Theo's perspective, even though he's not exactly with her when it happens. At the museum also, he meets an older man and his young charge, who he later finds out is the old man's niece. And after the blast, Theo spends some time with this old man. He gives him a piece of jewelry, which links him to this artwork. So of course we know that this event is very impactful on this young man's life. But when we meet him again at the beginning of the book now, when he's 27 and he's still having trouble sleeping because of these dreams, you're wondering, is there more to the story? And of course there is. The rest of the book, like I said, is 771 pages, and even making allowances for the very intense artistic references and very precise directions that Donna Tartt goes through to show you the young boy moving around Manhattan and this expansive landscape of art and history and geography. The author takes her time laying out this very expansive landscape and showing how the mother and son are immersed in this sea of service people and doormen, and yet very alone, so that when the mother dies and dies suddenly, the young boy is catapulted into lonesomeness and surrounded by people who he has no real connection to, while the people who should be closest to him have abandoned him. Like, his grandparents offer to pay for him to go to a hotel instead of come to live with them. A 13-year-old boy, they want to pay his hotel bills. Instead of stepping up to accept responsibility and take custody of him, his ne'er-do-well father is also missing. And so because of the lack of these connections, Theo then latches on to the 2 people who he shares his survivor's guilt with, and that is the old man who gave him the piece of jewelry, this old man's business partner and niece. So Hobie and Pippa become central characters in the novel. And as unlikely as that is, it forms a framework for the rest of the novel and, of course, the revelation of the title, which is the Goldfinch, which is appearing from behind this shroud, behind this covering. And so you know it's profound, you know it's pregnant with meaning. What is the Goldfinch? What does it mean? For a lot of the book, I wasn't sure what I was reading. It's speculative fiction, but it's also beautiful. So whilst there were some parts of it that were confusing, I wasn't sure what it was going to be. I enjoyed every minute of the exploration. 4.5 stars, I think, for this one. I finished reading Mouse by Art Spiegelman. This is a graphic novel memoir. It won the Pulitzer Prize in 1992 and is the first of its kind to have won that award. The artist is Art Spiegelman, and he uses the cartoon format to narrate the life of his father, Wladek Spiegelman, who's a Polish immigrant and Jewish Holocaust survivor who immigrated from Poland and is now living in Rego Park, Queens, New York. I'm not usually a huge fan of the graphic novel genre, but the artist drew me in with the allegory and the other literary devices that he achieved and did so well with. Like, he represents the persecuted Jews as mice, and he uses other animals to represent other racial and political groups within the novel. And I thought that that was such a clever way of showing the differences and the animalistic tendencies of humans, as well as kind of pit these animals against each other, which, if you're interested in the animal kingdom and which animal reigns supreme, this becomes like a side plot and a very effectively done one. He also never shows the swastika in its entirety, which I think was a very clever way of showing the German influence on Jewish history, acknowledging but not celebrating it. So there were lots of very intricately inlaid literary techniques used here, and I was a huge fan of that, even if I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of the cartoons. Other things that I noticed and thought the artist did really well at: he portrays his very flawed Holocaust survivor father in a pretty authentic way. Like, his father speaks broken English, and he portrays him almost mutilating the language when he says something odious. But because of his accent, which, I don't know, you kind of get his accent from reading, you're immediately drawn back into empathy and ultimately acceptance of his character. Wladek Spiegelman is a flawed hero, if he is a hero at all. In fact, most survivor stories seem to be told so that the characters come away looking like heroes, but Art Spiegelman seems to challenge this establishment by portraying his father as flawed, like really flawed. In fact, he seems to go out of his way to portray his father's flaws and emphasize them. When we meet them, Art is a child, and his father observes him being mistreated by his friends. And while we kind of understand the tough love, his father trying to show him not to rely on other people, he's pretty harsh towards him, almost dismissing what his son went through to teach him the lesson instead. And as we see the adult Art interacting with his father, he's very clear to mention that he and his father aren't close. And when he goes to speak with him, kind of to interview him and pitch the idea of making this book about him, he shows his father in 3 relationships with women, and in all of them he's behaving in a really odious way. He's mistreating his current wife, and then we see him pretty much ditching his poor girlfriend in order to marry the richer one. And as we keep turning the pages, we see him move from just character flaws to criminal behavior. Like, he initially lies to escape the war, and he may or may not have killed someone for absolutely no reason other than that he was angry. And we eventually see him leading his army through a system of lies. Is he a hero, or is he the anti-hero? Is he a hero just because he was involved in the Holocaust and survived it? Or is he a hero for the things that he did? So while all of these situations and characterizations may be necessary to establish authenticity, it also forces us to acknowledge that some of his behaviors are unethical, and it evokes very complicated feelings from the reader. And yet the story gets even worse as we see the son becoming the father, as Art and Wladek's characters start to merge, and Art starts to do some of the odious things that he formerly chastised his father for doing. We start to explore the effect of the relationship between the father and the son, and the influence that parents can have on children, even when we might make a conscious decision to reject some of those teachings. I really enjoyed reading this book, and it gave me a new appreciation for what complicated literary techniques graphic novels can accomplish. So I might pick up another one before too long. I read The Frolic of Beasts by Yukio Mishima, and I got a galley copy from NetGalley in order to review. And he's a pretty popular Japanese author, so this is translated fiction, translated decades after this author committed suicide. And I'd never heard anything about him, but reading his story really hyped me up for the drama in the novel, and it was dramatic. It read like a tragic comedy drama, like Japanese anime or something. It was a hero-villain story about a love triangle, 3 characters who at no point were you ever sure who the villain and who the victims were. The novel had very exaggerated characters, and it was told in the style of recurring poetic lines, and so it made for a very dramatic kind of Shakespearean read, tragic comedy at its best, but Japanese drama. At the center of the novel are 3 main characters, a couple and a young man that they take into their midst. Until the codependent relationship between this very unlikely threesome pushes the boundaries and extends into the relationships that they have with the other characters, and it becomes this very complex tale of love and sacrifice and jealousy and unrequited love and infidelity, and mythical relationships are being explored. I'm not sure how else to explain this, but it was a very wonderfully multi-layered but still very characteristically terse Japanese writing. I loved this story. I feel like I wanted to give it 5 stars. Layers of intrigue in the story brought me back to the story of the author himself, where we have Ippei, who is the fictional character in this novel. He's a middle-aged writer who at the height of his career got cut down by violence. And it reminded me of the story of the author's life, because Yukio Mishima at the height of his writing career committed suicide, the ultimate act of violence against himself. But even throughout the novel, we see strains of maybe the author Yukio Mishima's existence and his struggles being reflected in the experiences that Ippei has. This sophisticated, generous man who gives so much to the world and is not able to get back even the basic love from his wife. And I love the parallels between, or I don't know if they're real parallels, but I like the perceived parallels between the fiction and the fact. And so for me, this was a thrilling read. I like the comparison that the author offered of wealth versus freedom, youth versus experience, marriage versus infidelity, culture versus religion, and native versus traveler. He offered lots of different examples of these various themes, but I think specifically I liked his characterization of women as antagonists and the roles that he gave them, which were very different from the misogynistic way that a lot of women characters are portrayed in traditional maybe Japanese or traditional Buddhist or traditional Asian literature. I liked how he pushed that boundary and had these women portrayed as still painted women, still very decorative characters, but also the strong, silent, antagonistic type who you're never really sure what to expect from them. Author again, Yukio Mishima, but the translator was Andrew Clare, and kudos to him for reviving this work, which was probably lost to the English readers for several decades, and Andrew Clare brought it back to us, so kudos to him. Kudos to all the translators who bring us translated fiction, which we otherwise probably would never hear about because we don't speak the author's native language. Another book I read was Hillbilly Elegy, a memoir of a family and culture in crisis, and this one is by J.D. Vance, or should I say J.D. Vance, future presidential nominee. We'll get to that later. But this book includes a lot of contradiction. The first being the author's name. J.D. stands for 2 different things. The first thing we know, I think around page 63, but the other explanation for his name doesn't come until almost at the end of the book. So as I was reading it, I was a little confused about why he had the name that he did. And it's not until later, much later, that he answers a lot of the questions that you have about this book. And I found that to be representative of a lot of my experience reading this book. I came into reading this book with some expectations. I thought that he was going to explain the origins of the hillbilly culture and show maybe the comparison between the hillbillies and other underrepresented or underserved groups within our society. Like, I think it's probably most likely that you'll compare the poor whites to systematically poor blacks, historically poor blacks. And in this book, he does kind of hint at that, but he doesn't go as far as to make the comparisons between those two cultures that you might expect. So I'm not sure if it's a limitation of the book or just a failure of the book to meet some of those expectations that I had. And whether that is fair or not, I don't know. But then we get to the story itself. And this book is the memoir of one boy within one family, within one community. And he uses his life and the experiences that he lived through and that of his family members as kind of a representative of an entire culture. And I don't know if that is correct or whether it's even fair to assume that he could do that, because J.D. Vance is an individual. He's not a sociologist. He's not a political candidate yet. But he uses his life and the lives of his family members to represent an entire society. And I don't know if he has the qualification to make that assumption. But even so, in the beginning, he starts off with a note by telling you that he doesn't know if he's qualified to write the book. And I completely agreed with that. He talks about his life. He talks about his experience. He talks about going to work and seeing people from his community who weren't committed to their job. He talks about low work ethic within his community as a characteristic of many people within his community. And he talks about the people who receive government assistance and whether or not they should, whether or not they deserve them. But then he goes later to talk about those government programs and even programs that he himself benefited from. And it seems as though he's kind of judging other people who've benefited from the same things that he used for his own upward mobility. So again, this book contains some contradiction, but the author is very clear to underline and underscore some points that he wants to make sure that you are very clear about. One is his strong sense of family and his commitment to the family members that have shared his life, shared his history, even if he doesn't necessarily agree with their actions and doesn't want to perpetrate some of the things that he learned from them. He does still have a strong sense of belonging to that culture. And he talks about his mother, his serial monogamist, drug abusing mother, and the fathers who have cycled in and out of his life. The biological father who gave him up for adoption even though he said he loved him, the adoptive father who claimed him and helped to raise him, the grandparents who, while they may have lived kind of outside of the law, were very good to him. They acted as his surrogate parents and definitely reinforced a lot of the values that he has now and that have helped shape him and make him into the person that he is. And so he pays homage to those members of his family, even when he doesn't agree with the choices that they've made for their lives and the choices that affected his. He talks about leaving school and enlisting in the military when, no one thought that he would make it. And the values that he started off with and that the military reinforced, but also the strong sense of belonging and patriotism that he developed from being in the military and joining the Marine Corps. And as we mentioned, the Marine Corps, he does address a lot of conspiracy theories that exist as it relates to the military and government involvement. But while he does mention them, he does his part to dispel them and to try to play up the patriotic pride and the sacrifices that men and women make for their country and for the rest of us, and kind of forces the reader to address the question of, should we really be complaining about the men and women who risk their lives for us, some of us who are not willing to make the same sacrifice? In this book, he asserts his various ideologies, as contradictory as some of them may seem. And while he keeps repeating that he is a conservative, he also goes out of his way to express his admiration for Barack Obama and the Obama administration. And so it's not quite clear where he stands on the political spectrum, except that he himself might be interested in running for political office. And I'm going to keep this book close to the shelf where I have books that have been written by or about presidential candidates or former presidents, because I expect that at some point we'll hear more about a political campaign from J.D. Vance, or should I say J.D. Vance. And just remember, you heard it here first. I appreciated a lot about this book. I like the author's candor in that he actually addressing the questions that I had about whether or not this was the right time for him to write this book. I don't know if he necessarily had lived out the rest of the life that would make the rest of this memoir answer some of the questions that I had about hillbilly culture. And so I don't know if this book is a little bit premature in that he's still a very young man who has escaped the hillbilly life and gone on to get an Ivy League education and has become pretty renowned in social circles, has really developed himself way past the limitations that his hillbilly life probably would have laid out for him. But I don't know if he has the professional or life experience to make the comparisons that I think I expected this book to have. And so while I appreciated it, I do have to say that there were some things that I felt were a little bit omitted. And I don't know if it was unfair for me to expect that he could bring them, but they weren't there. So I'm giving this 3 out of 5 stars because I was intrigued but not completely satisfied by reading this. And then I read Wranglers Rescue by B.J. Daniels. This is the end of the Montana Cahill series. I've been reading this series for over a year now. And while I'm not necessarily a fan of Harlequin romance mass market paperback books, I was very intrigued when I started reading the series, and it's one that I have followed, and I'm pretty sad that it has come to an end. I love the series. I didn't necessarily love all the books. There were a lot of twists and turns that the author took me through in the various installments, and some of them I agreed with, some of them I didn't like. Some of the situations I found that I couldn't get behind. Some of the romances started with adultery and infidelity, and that's not something that I can really get behind. But overall, I love the series. So Wranglers Rescue is the last of these books, and I don't have the book right now, which is why it's appearing on the screen. But the premise of this one, well, the premise of the series is that we have a group of adult siblings, and in each progressive installment, another sibling finds love. Some of the romances are rekindling of former relationships, high school sweethearts, and first loves. And some of them are people that they've just met kind of by the way because, well, they've met new people. And in this installment, we have the last of the siblings, the last single sibling, and he starts a relationship, kind of a relationship, with someone who's working for his family. But somehow this cowboy who almost never leaves home goes away on business, meets another woman, falls in love with her, and gets married to her on a cruise ship when he's just supposed to be a few towns over. But then he disappears, and the report is that he's gone overboard, lost forever, and the young woman who he started the relationship with, but not really, she decides to go prove whether he's alive or dead. And so the rest of the story is her trying to find out whether he's alive or whether the book is going to end with one sibling still unaccounted for on the love spectrum. I liked a lot of things about this book. It was a pretty easy read, but overall my ratings for the individual books are not as high as my ratings for the entire series. So the series is what I recommend, not necessarily a specific book. There were a lot of twists and turns. What I liked about B.J. Daniels is that she doesn't just write about romance, she includes some crime, some drama, some political intrigue. There's a lot of very good down-home family values. I mean, I don't know if I could necessarily say down-home because this is Montana and my down-home is Jamaica, but I enjoyed reading these cowboy romances. And you know, some of the situations with women, they're a little stereotypical, but it was also good fun reading. And if you're a fan of Harlequin romance, I would recommend this series. This is one that I'm going to be gifting to someone because I have a lot of the paperbacks now. I think I have 6 of the books. That was Wranglers Rescue by B.J. Daniels. This is the last of the Cahill, Montana. Overall, my rating for each individual book is not as high as my rating for the series because the author is pretty skilled at bringing these controversial themes. Like, she introduces these complicated love triangles and what seems like manipulative relationships, but she also brings to life these very sympathetic characters that will have you rooting for them even when they do what you wish they wouldn't. So I found the plot of each book and also of the entire series, the way she kept bringing back old storylines and showing development of the characters as well as subplots that were covered in earlier books. I thought that that was pretty masterful, and so I'm giving the series 4 out of 5 stars. And this book, well, is just the conclusion of a series that I really enjoyed. I also read Quantum Convention, which is a series of short stories by Eric Schlick, and the first of the 8 stories is the title, Quantum Convention. In it we meet a young husband named Colin. He has a wife named Jane, and she's eager for them to start a family, but Colin is not so sure that he's ready to give up on the artistic dreams that being a father would require him to sacrifice. And so he lies to her and goes to this convention, a quantum convention, where at the convention he's able to meet these alternate personas that he would have, these other people that he could have been if he hadn't made the decisions that have caused him to be the Colin that we meet at the beginning of the story. So the story is a scientific thought experiment, and it is the same kind of experiment that all the stories offer. An opportunity for the reader to reflect along with the author, see what kind of choices we make, what are some of the things that we do, what are some of the things that we accept, what are some of the things that we sacrifice, and what are some of the things that we keep that allow us to have the identities that we do, that allow us to be the people that we are. The author in some of the stories does offer a kind of cynical look at relationships and some of the sacrifices that we have to make in order to claim the identity that we want. But I felt like this as an experiment, as a thought experiment, was just so brilliant. The stories were just controversial and layered enough to be interesting, but also gave an opportunity for us as readers to go through the process with the characters from the safety of the lives that we have chosen. I really enjoyed a lot about this book, and so while I read an electronic galley copy, this is a book that I would like to own, and in fact I'm wearing my yellow sweater because the boy on the cover of Quantum Convention is wearing a yellow sweater. I recommend this book to nerds and geeks of all ilk, especially to people like me who are very interested in multiverse theories. If you're a fan of Gwyneth Paltrow's Sliding Doors, you will love this book, and I recommend it to you especially. I read Peter Watson's Fallout on the recommendation of Steve Donahue, who is a very famous booktuber. If you're not already following him, then definitely check out his channel. He spoke very highly of this book, and I wanted to pick it up, so I did during Nonfiction November. The book is subtitled Conspiracy, Coverup, and the Deceitful Case for the Atom Bomb, A New History. And I think it is very well titled because the author immediately goes into the scientists who were working on the atomic bomb project in the early 1900s and how the government kind of manipulated these scientists, and the conspiracy and deceit that occurred in many different ways. For example, the alliance between the different governments that should have been working together on fighting the Germans during World War II. According to this author, the British government kept very valuable and vital information from the American government, who in turn was keeping information from the scientists who were working on the Manhattan Project and pretty much the project to work on these nuclear reactors. Fallout is subtitled Conspiracy, Coverup, and the Deceitful Case for the Atom Bomb, A New History. Watson gets right into the cover-up, citing Albert Einstein's famous equation that matter and energy are essentially different aspects of the same phenomenon, E = mc squared. So matter and energy are essentially related through the speed of light. In going through the history, however, Watson shows that what should have been a groundbreaking advancement within a single generation after Einstein's discovery, that knowledge was being used to harness energy to kill people. And so the author spends a fair amount of time exploring the science behind the discoveries made by Einstein and his peers. Marie Curie and the Curie Joliots and the Niels Bohr characters that pepper this novel. Ultimately, he's also showing the personalization of these characters and showing the conflicts that developed between these scientists, many of them who were persecuted Jews escaping Europe during World War II and now feeling through personal compulsion or some external influence the need to prove their loyalties to these new countries that had offered them exile, and in turn forcing them or not to build these powerful weapons without much say on what these weapons would be used to do. So while this book does engage a lot of scientific thought, the author does compile these personal stories of little known scientists. I mean, maybe they're only little known to me, but he talks about the relationship between Niels Bohr and his son Agage, who's also a scientist, and shows these European refugees entering the United States with fake British passports that have them listed as a different name so that their nuclear fission research could remain under the radar. So while the book does include a lot of science and would be perfect for a science nerd like me, someone who enjoys hearing what scientists do when they go to cocktail parties, even if you're not like that, even if you're only interested in the science as it relates to the atomic bomb being discovered and developed, this is a book that you could still engage with and still get a lot from, because there's so much history in here, there's so much political intrigue and political drama in here that it becomes a very interesting and intriguing read, even if you skim the science bits. If you have even a basic understanding of chemistry, you'll have no problem navigating through the footnotes that Watson includes here and the conspiratorial tone that the author adopts when he highlights the dual interests of these very colorful characters that pepper these pages. It makes Fallout a thrilling book for a person who's interested in history or American or European history in general, from any perspective. So I'm recommending Fallout and I'm giving this 4 stars. 4 stars. It probably deserves a higher rating, but I'm being conservative this time and allowing myself to maybe come back to this later. This is a book that I want to own and possibly reread at some point, because I feel like I'm going to be quoting a lot of this information to other people as I discuss the science behind the atom bomb in those cocktail parties that scientists go to. And so that's it. Those are the 9 books that I read in November. Leave me a comment down below. Let me know which of these books you read and whether you enjoyed the ones that I did or you had different thoughts. From me, I'd love to hear your comments. I'd love to hear your reactions to these books in the comments down below. So let's talk down there. Give me a thumbs up if you like this video. Subscribe if you haven't already. And feel free to share this video with someone who doesn't know that I have a booktube channel. If you know another book lover who you think might enjoy talking with me about books, I'd love to meet them. So go ahead and introduce us. And thanks for watching. So we'll talk in the comments. And until next time, happy reading. Bye.